All right, guys, so now to address the final question of the symmetry of your data set. So remember, there are three things that that our data could possibly be. There are more shapes that your data can take on, but for sixth grade sake and simplicity's sake, we're only looking at three. We're going to look at, is our data symmetrical? Is our data um, or is our data skewed? And then if it's skewed, you have to tell, is it right skewed or left skewed? Okay, so when you're looking at box plots, so this is the first one that we're talking about, box plots. How do I figure out if my box plot is skewed or symmetrical? So what they have done here, this picture has done, which is a really great way to identify if your box plot is skewed or symmetrical, is draw a line that is the same length as your box plot or fairly similar. So you draw a line that's pretty similar to your box plot, and wherever your Q2 is, you draw that line up. Wherever your Q1 is, you draw that one, and that's always going to be a little bit lower because remember that our Q1s and our Q2s are talking about the medians of our upper and lower halves of our data, so that isn't going to be as large as our Q2. So they're both going to be a little bit lower. And then the last thing they did was they just kind of drew a line over it to show you that it's pretty symmetrical. And if you look at the data set, I wanted the eraser. If you look at the data set itself, if you're just looking at this data set right smack dab in the middle of it, it looks fairly even. It looks like, this is half and this is half. It doesn't look like it's scooted over to one side or another. It looks fairly symmetrical. But when we look at our right skewed, this is half of our data, and then that's half of our data. So that one does, oops, wrong page. That one does look like it's not even. So if you look in the symmetrical, the lines that I just drew over it to represent that this is half of the data and that's another half are fairly equal to each other, but my red lines over my third box plot are not even. My first line, which represents the first half of my data, because remember, your whisker and the first part of your box plot both represent 25% of your data. So the first part of my data, first half, is a lot smaller than the second half of my data. So remember, so this one would definitely be skewed, and when naming it, whichever one has the tail, so if you look back up here, here's my little tail that kind of drifts off. That's going to tell you the name of the skewed. So that's going into the right direction, so my answer would be right skewed. When looking at your box plot, it's whatever line is the longer. Okay, so if we're looking at this, my line over here is longer than my first one, and that's on the right-hand side, so it's still right skewed. Looking at the other side, again, here's my first half of my data, here's my second half. They're both not even with each other. My longest one is on the left-hand side, so that would be left skewed. When you're looking at dot plots, it's very similar. Here, they just kind of drew a dome over your dot plot. So if this is my dot plot, draw a dome over it, make sure you encompass everything. That's fairly symmetrical. It's fairly even on both sides. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect because look, this one has 4 on this column and this one only has 3 on this column. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just looking at, is my dome fairly even from one side to the other, which in this case it is. When you draw a dome over this second one, we go up and then it goes down, okay? It shifts that dome over. It's not perfectly in the center anymore, but it shifts it over where our height is on our left. And remember, we're looking at the tail, so over here is my tail where it's going down, so that would be right skewed. Same thing, we're looking at our dome over here, and again, it shifts my height over to the right, which means my tail is on the left, so it should be called left skewed. It's almost like whenever a football player jukes somebody, if they're going to the right to juke them, they're leaving a trail on the left-hand side. Okay, and that's the tail we're talking about.